Welcome to Book Summareez, your daily dose of wisdom in minutes. Let's dive in. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous verminous bug. He lay on his armor-hard back and saw, as he lifted his head up a little, his brown, arched abdomen divided up into rigid bow-like sections. From this height, the blanket, just about ready to slide off completely, could hardly stay in place. His numerous legs, pitifully thin in comparison to the rest of his circumference, flickered helplessly before his eyes. What's happened to me, he thought. It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being only somewhat too small, lay quietly between the four well-known walls. Above the table, on which an unpacked collection of sample cloth goods was spread out, Samsa was a traveling salesman, hung the picture which he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a little while ago and set in a pretty gilt frame. It was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur boa. She sat erect there, lifting up in the direction of the viewer a solid fur muff into which her entire forearm disappeared. Gregor's glance then turned to the window. The dreary weather, the rain drops were falling audibly down on the metal window ledge, made him quite melancholy. Why don't I keep sleeping for a little while longer and forget all this foolishness, he thought. But this was entirely impractical, for he was used to sleeping on his right side, and in his present state he couldn't get himself into this position. No matter how hard he threw himself onto his right side, he always rolled again onto his back. He must have tried it 100 times, closing his eyes, so that he would not have to see the wriggling legs, and gave up only when he began to feel a light, dull pain in his side which he had never felt before. Oh God, he thought, what a demanding job I've chosen, day in, day out on the road. The stresses of trade are much greater than the work going on at head office, and in addition to that, I have to deal with the problems of traveling, the worries about train connections, irregular bad food, temporary and constantly changing human relationships which never come from the heart. To hell with it all, he felt a slight itching on the top of his abdomen. He slowly pushed himself on his back closer to the bedpost so that he could lift his head more easily, found the itchy part, which was entirely covered with small white spots. He did not know what to make of them, and wanted to feel the place with a leg. But he retracted it immediately, for the contact felt like a cold shower all over him. He slid back again into his earlier position. This getting up early, he thought, makes a man quite idiotic. A man must have his sleep. Other traveling salesmen live like harem women. For instance, when I come back to the inn during the course of the morning to write up the necessary orders, these gentlemen are just sitting down to breakfast. If I were to try that with my boss, I'd be thrown out on the spot. Still, who knows whether that mightn't be really good for me. If I didn't hold back for my parents' sake, I would have quit ages ago. I would have gone to the boss and told him just what I think from the bottom of my heart. He would have fallen right off his desk. How weird it is to sit up at the desk and talk down to the employee from way up there. The boss has trouble hearing, so the employee has to step up quite close to him. Anyway, I haven't completely given up that hope yet. Once I've got together the money to pay off the parents' debt to him, that should take another 5 or 6 years. I'll do it for sure. Then I'll make the big break. In any case, right now I have to get up. My train leaves at 5 o'clock. And he looked over at the alarm clock ticking away by the chest of drawers. Good God, he thought. It was 6:30 and the hands were going quietly on. It was past the half hour, already nearly 1:45. Could the alarm have failed to ring? One saw from the bed that it was properly set for 4 o'clock. Certainly it had rung. Yes, but was it possible to sleep through this noise that made the furniture shake? Now it's true he'd not slept quietly, but evidently he'd slept all the more deeply. Still, what should he do now? The next train left at 7 o'clock. To catch that one, he would have to go in a mad rush. The sample collection wasn't packed up yet, and he really didn't feel particularly fresh and active. And even if he caught the train, there was no avoiding a blow-up with the boss, because the firm's errand boy would have waited for the 5 o'clock train and reported the news of his absence long ago. He was the boss's minion, without backbone or intelligence. Well then, what if he reported in sick? But that would be extremely embarrassing and suspicious, because during his 5 years, service Gregor hadn't been sick even once. The boss would certainly come with the doctor from the health insurance company and would reproach his parents for their lazy son and cut short all objections with the insurance doctor's comments. For him, everyone was completely healthy but really lazy about work. And besides, would the doctor in this case be totally wrong? Apart from a really excessive drowsiness after the long sleep, Gregor in fact felt quite well and even had a really strong appetite. As he was thinking all this over in the greatest haste, without being able to make the decision to get out of bed, the alarm clock was indicating exactly 7:15. there was a cautious knock on the door by the head of the bed. "Gregor," a voice called. It was his mother. "It's 6:45. Don't you want to be on your way?" The soft voice. Gregor was startled when he heard his voice answering. It was clearly and unmistakably his earlier voice, but in it was intermingled, as if from below, an irrepressibly painful squeaking which left the words positively distinct only in the first moment and distorted them in the reverberation, so that one didn't know if one had heard correctly. Gregor wanted to answer in detail and explain everything, but in these circumstances he confined himself to saying, "Yes, yes, thank you, mother. I'm getting up right away." Because of the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice was not really noticeable outside, so his mother calmed down with this explanation and shuffled off. However, as a result of the short conversation, the other family members became aware of the fact that Gregor was unexpectedly still at home, and already his father was knocking on one side door, weakly but with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he called out, "what's going on?" And after a short while he urged him on again in a deeper voice. "Gregor, Gregor." At the other side door, however, his sister knocked lightly. "Gregor, are you all right? Do you need anything?" Gregor directed answers in both directions. "I'll be ready right away." He made an effort with the most careful articulation and by inserting long pauses between the individual words to remove everything remarkable from his voice. His father turned back to his breakfast. However, the sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I beg you." Gregor had no intention of opening the door, but congratulated himself on his precaution, acquired from traveling, of locking all doors during the night, even at home. First he wanted to stand up quietly and undisturbed, get dressed, above all have breakfast, and only then consider further action, for he noticed this clearly. By thinking things over in bed he would not reach a reasonable conclusion. He remembered that he had already often felt a light pain or other in bed, perhaps the result of an awkward lying position, which later turned out to be purely imaginary when he stood up, and he was eager to see how his present fantasies would gradually dissipate. That the change in his voice was nothing other than the onset of a real chill, an occupational illness of commercial travelers, of that he had not the slightest doubt. It was very easy to throw aside the blanket. He needed only to push himself up a little and it fell by itself. But to continue was difficult, particularly because he was so unusually wide. He needed arms and hands to push himself upright. Instead of these, however, he had only many small limbs which were incessantly moving with very different motions, and which, in addition, he was unable to control. If he wanted to bend one of them, then it was the first to extend itself, and if he finally succeeded doing with this limb what he wanted, in the meantime all the others, as if left free, moved around in an excessively painful agitation. "But I must not stay in bed uselessly," said Gregor to himself. At first he wanted to get of the bed with the lower part of his body, but this lower part, which he incidentally had not yet looked at, and which he also couldn't picture clearly, proved itself too difficult to move. The attempt went so slowly. When, having become almost frantic, he finally hurled himself forward with all his force and without thinking, he chose his direction incorrectly, and he hit the lower bedpost hard. The violent pain he felt revealed to him that the lower part of his body was at the moment probably the most sensitive. Thus he tried to get his upper body out of the bed first and turned his head carefully toward the edge of the bed. He managed to do this easily, and in spite of its width and weight his body mass at last slowly followed the turning of his head. But as he finally raised his head outside the bed in the open air, he became anxious about moving forward any further in this manner, for if he allowed himself eventually to fall by this process, it would take a miracle to prevent his head from getting injured. And at all costs he must not lose consciousness right now. He preferred to remain in bed. However, after a similar effort, while he lay there again sighing as before and once again saw his small limbs fighting one another, if anything worse than before, and didn't see any chance of imposing quiet and order on this arbitrary movement, he told himself again that he couldn't possibly remain in bed, and that it might be the most reasonable thing to sacrifice everything if there was even the slightest hope of getting himself out of bed in the process. At the same moment, however, he didn't forget to remind himself from time to time of the fact that calm, indeed the calmest, reflection might be better than the most confused decisions. At such moments he directed his gaze as precisely as he could toward the window, but unfortunately there was little confident cheer to be had from a glance at the morning mist, which concealed even the other side of the narrow street. "It's already 7 o'clock, he told himself at the latest striking of the alarm clock. Already 7 o'clock and still such a fog. And for a little while longer he lay quietly with weak breathing, as if perhaps waiting for normal and natural conditions to re-emerge out of the complete stillness. But then he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, whatever happens I must be completely out of bed. Besides, by then someone from the office will arrive to inquire about me, because the office will open before 7 o'clock. And he made an effort then to rock his entire body length out of the bed with a uniform motion. If he let himself fall out of the bed in this way, his head, which in the course of the fall he intended to lift up sharply, would probably remain uninjured. His back seemed to be hard, nothing would really happen to that as a result of the fall. His greatest reservation was a worry about the loud noise which the fall must create and which presumably would arouse, if not fright, then at least concern on the other side of all the doors. However, it had to be tried. As Gregor was in the process of lifting himself half out of bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. He needed only to rock with a constant rhythm. It struck him how easy all this would be if someone were to come to his aid. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the servant girl, would have been quite sufficient. They would have only had to push their arms under his arched back to get him out of the bed, to bend down with their load, and then merely to exercise patience and care that he completed the flip onto the floor, where his diminutive legs would then, he hoped, acquire a purpose. Now, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, should he really call out for help? In spite of all his distress, he was unable to suppress a smile at this idea. He had already got to the point where, with a stronger rocking, he maintained his equilibrium with difficulty, and very soon he would finally have to decide, for in 5 minutes it would be 7:15. Then there was a ring at the door of the apartment. That's someone from the office, he told himself, and he almost froze while his small limbs only danced around all the faster. For one moment everything remained still. They aren't opening, Gregor said to himself, caught up in some absurd hope. But of course then, as usual, the servant girl with her firm tread went to the door and opened it. Gregor needed to hear only the visitor's first word of greeting to recognize immediately who it was, the manager himself. Why was Gregor the only one condemned to work in a firm where at the slightest lapse someone immediately attracted the greatest suspicion? Were all the employees then collectively, one and all, scoundrels? Was there then among them no truly devoted person who, if he failed to use just a couple of hours in the morning for office work, would become abnormal from pangs of conscience and really be in no state to get out of bed? Was it really not enough to let an apprentice make inquiries, if such questioning was even necessary? Must the manager himself come, and in the process must it be demonstrated to the entire innocent family that the investigation of this suspicious circumstance could only be entrusted to the intelligence of the manager? And more as a consequence of the excited state in which this idea put Gregor than as a result of an actual decision, he swung himself with all his might out of the bed. There was a loud thud, but not a real crash. The fall was absorbed somewhat by the carpet, and in addition, his back was more elastic than Gregor had thought. For that reason, the dull noise was not quite so conspicuous, but he had not held his head up with sufficient care and had hit it. He turned his head, irritated and in pain, and rubbed it on the carpet. "Something has fallen in there," said the manager in the next room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine to himself whether something similar to what had happened to him today could ever happen to the manager. In fact, one had to concede that it was possible. However, as if in rude reply to this question, the manager took a couple of decisive steps in the next room and made the floorboards creak. In the room on the right, Gregor's sister whispered to inform Gregor, "Gregor, the manager is here." "Yes, I know," said Gregor to himself, but he did not dare to speak out loud enough that his sister could hear it. "Gregor," his father said now from the room on the left, "the manager has come. Why didn't you leave on the early train?" And now the voices of the father and the manager were speaking at the same time. The sister was pleading. Why wasn't Gregor up? Was he unwell? He should open the door. His father was threatening. If Gregor didn't open the door, he would call the locksmith. And already the father was loudly pounding on the door with his fist. Amidst all this din, Gregor realized it was impossible to make himself understood. He had to get the manager to see him and explain the situation. This, he reasoned, was the key to everything. Calm would then return and everyone would assist him. But the manager would become impatient, suspect the worst, and force his way in. Therefore, Gregor concentrated all his energy on getting to the door. He dragged himself across the floor, a slow and arduous task. He tried to ignore the chaos of voices and the pain in his body. He focused on reaching the door and somehow turning the key with his mouth. Finally, after much effort, he reached the door. He tried to grip the key with his mouth and turn it. He writhed and struggled, but the key wouldn't budge. The manager's voice grew more impatient, the father's pounding more insistent. In desperation, Gregor threw himself against the door with all his weight. The lock snapped open, and he tumbled into the room. The sight that greeted the manager was horrific. Gregor, now undeniably an enormous insect, lay sprawled on the floor. The manager recoiled in disgust and fear. He backed away toward the door, his face pale. "What is this?" he stammered. Gregor tried to speak, to explain, but only a garbled squeak emerged from his throat. He realized the hopelessness of his situation. He was trapped in this monstrous form, unable to communicate or reason with anyone. His mother, hearing the commotion, rushed into the room and fainted at the sight of Gregor. His father, enraged and distraught, seized a walking stick and advanced on Gregor, driving him back into his room. The door was slammed shut, and Gregor was once again alone in his room, injured and despairing. He reflected on the loss of his humanity, his job, and his family's affection. He was now an outcast, a burden, a source of shame. Days turned into weeks. Gregor's room became his prison. His sister, Gret, initially took pity on him and brought him food. She tried to discern his preferences, offering him a variety of dishes. Gregor, however, found most human food repulsive. He preferred decaying scraps and vegetables. As time passed, Gret's compassion waned. She found the task of caring for Gregor increasingly unpleasant. She resented the time and effort it consumed. The family's financial situation grew dire, and they were forced to sell their belongings and take in lodgers. Gregor was now completely isolated. He spent his days crawling on the walls and ceiling, finding solace in the limited space he could explore. He was starved of human contact and understanding. One evening, the lodgers, who were fastidious and demanding, complained about the dirt and disorder in the house. Gret, exasperated, declared that they could no longer tolerate Gregor's presence. "We must get rid of it," she said. "It's the only way." Her words struck Gregor like a death knell. He realized that he was no longer wanted, no longer loved. He was a burden, a thing to be discarded. Over time, Gregor began to starve himself of purpose, now seeing himself as an abomination of nature that needed to go away. Overnight, he succumbed to his ailments and died. The next morning, the cleaning lady found his lifeless body. The family was relieved. They disposed of Gregor's body and began to make plans for the future. They moved to a smaller apartment and found work. Gret, in particular, blossomed. She was now a young woman, full of life and promise. As they rode the tram one day, the parents realized how ready and fit their daughter was for marriage. The story ends with the family looking forward to a brighter future, free from the burden of Gregor's metamorphosis. They had survived the ordeal and were ready to embrace a new life.